A few days after the Brazilian Grand Prix, the UK went to the polls, and despite pre-election predictions of a close race and a Labour victory, against the background of continued economic recession, the Conservative government was re-elected with a reduced but still workable majority of 336 seats to 271, and with an unusually high turnout, this remains the highest total number of votes cast for any party in a British general election. No party had won 4 in a row since 1826. Many at the time blamed Labour's triumphalist Sheffield rally for making the party seem overconfident and arrogant, while the Sun newspaper, which had come out in favour of the Tories, claimed credit for itself, though later analysis suggests that neither of these factors had as big an influence as was thought at the time. The day after the election, the largest bomb detonated on the British mainland since World War II, a 1-ton bomb made of fertiliser and Semtex supplied by Libya and hidden in a van, was detonated by the IRA near the Baltic Exchange, an important financial centre for the maritime shipping and insurance industries, in the heart of the City of London. A few hours later, another was detonated near the major Staples Corner road junction. In both cases, the IRA telephoned warnings to the police in advance, 20 minutes for the Baltic Exchange bomb and 43 for the Staples Corner one, and police were able to mostly evacuate the areas, but 3 people were nonetheless killed and 91 injured in the Baltic Exchange bomb. The attacks were a response by the IRA to the victory of John Major in the election, since he had maintained the Thatcher government's policy of refusing to negotiate until the IRA announced an end to hostilities. The historic Baltic Exchange building, meanwhile, was damaged beyond reasonable repair, and the institution moved a few doors up. The original site of the Baltic Exchange is now home to the Gherkin. Outside the UK, violence seemed to be spreading across the globe too, as the post-communist world order continued its birth agonies. As the siege of Sarajevo tightened, and the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh intensified, with civilians as usual caught in the middle, Afghan President Mohammad Najibullah was ousted. Najibullah's socialist government was no longer propped up by the Soviet troops, and had only survived as long as it had because the various rebel groups, 6 of which were currently besieging Kabul, couldn't agree on the structure of what should replace it. Eventually, one group, supported by Pakistan, which was keen to stop the chaos on its own border, got fed up and entered Kabul. In the US, riots broke out in Los Angeles when the 4 officers accused of assaulting motorist Rodney King, whose beating had been videoed and released to media the previous year, were acquitted. Racial and social tensions that had been building up for decades boiled over in a 6-day riot that caused 63 deaths and over $1 billion in damage before the California National Guard and a contingent of US Marines restored some semblance of order. While the primary anger of the African-American community was against the LAPD, there was also a lot of tension that spilled into violence between them and the Korean-American community, not helped when a Korean-American store owner had shot and killed a black teenage girl he suspected of shoplifting just 6 days after the Rodney King tape surfaced. In Bosnia, the bridge at Britsko over the river Sava, which formed the border with Croatia, was blown up by Bosnian Serb militias, while over 100 civilians were on it. Either refugees leaving Bosnia to escape the fighting, or refugees already in Croatia popping back over to visit families for the May Day weekend. This came a few days after the old socialist Yugoslavia had officially ceased to exist, as the 2 remaining republics, Serbia and Montenegro, formed a new state called the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, adopting a new flag, which was the same as the old one but without the red star. And in Sierra Leone, a coup deposed President Saido Momo, who had been in power since 1986. The country had been plunged into a civil war a year earlier, and this new coup was led by a formerly loyalist army officer, a 25-year-old captain named Valentin Strasser, who had been disgusted by his government's incompetence in supplying and in supporting its soldiers. Strasser naturally took the reins of power himself, becoming the world's youngest head of state. An American-born historian who'd lived in Sierra Leone most of his life was sent off to the US Embassy to see if America would recognise the new government, and received the answer that while they didn't generally approve of coups, it wasn't like the previous government had been democratically elected either, so yeah, sure, why not? The F1 circus reconvened for its first European race in Barcelona, the Spanish Grand Prix having been moved to a spring slot as the city geared up to host the Summer Olympics, which were due to begin at the end of July, followed by the Paralympics in September. In fact, the race had been, somewhat inconsistently, marketed as the Grand Prix of the Olympic Games. French fans nearly missed out. Silvio Berlusconi's TV network La Cinq, which had had F1 broadcasting rights in France, had got into financial trouble over the winter, and when a rescue plan failed, had gone off the air in mid-April. A bidding war took place between the commercial TF1 network, owned by one Francis Bouygues, sometime sponsor of the AGS team, and the state-owned Antenne 2 and FR3 channels, with the former winning out and announcing the signing of Alain Prost on COCOM duties. And on the subject of broadcasting, this would also be the first race to go out live in Russia, where Bernie Ecclestone still hoped to race someday. In the paddock in Barcelona was Swiss car builder Peter Sauber, whose partnership with Mercedes in sports cars had been so successful. He was in Spain to formally announce his new F1 project, due to take to the track for 1993, with power by Ilmor and Karl Wendlinger behind the wheel. If the March team had entertained any hopes of forming the nucleus of a new Mercedes team in F1, this seemed to firmly dash them. There was bad news too for Eric Bernard, who'd been recovering well from his accident in Japan and was starting to talk to teams about a 1993 drive and planning to enter Le Mans for Peugeot, only to crash while testing the Peugeot sports car at Paul Ricard, break his leg again and set everything back. Over at Brabham, meanwhile, Giovanna Amati was shown the door after failing to attract any more funding, but despite the team's serious financial woes, the spare car was seized to pay off creditors as they crossed the Spanish border, Dennis Nursey took a punt on Williams test driver Damon Hill, who was highly recommended, but quite old for a debutante and without much financial backing. Car number 8, Damon Hill. Son of double world champion Graham Hill, Damon had a comfortable childhood and a private education, but when his illustrious father died in a plane crash in 1975, the Hill family found their circumstances reduced. Damon took a job as a motorcycle courier to pay for his education and found his way into motorcycle racing in 1981, before his mother persuaded him to try something a bit safer, car racing, in 1983. Although showing only above-average aptitude, he graduated into Formula Ford, but found circumstances and a lack of sponsorship seeming to thwart his efforts to progress into F3000. Eventually, though, he was given a chance with a backmarking F3000 team. He drove well but was never successful, winning no races and scoring just 2 podiums in the 3 seasons in the category. However, he was picked out by Williams as their test driver and helped to hone the FW14B into what has been the dominant force in 1992 so far, which in turn led him to being asked to fill the hole at Brabham. At 32, he's making his debut at an age when other drivers are starting to think about retirement planning, and Brabham probably doesn't look like the place to make a name for himself. There were new cars in the paddock, as is often the case at the first European race, most notably the new Benetton B192, with an even more pronounced raised nose than its predecessors, and from the next race at Imola it will be powered by the 7th generation Ford HB, restoring Benetton to having engine superiority over the customer Ford teams. The new car has also swapped its livery around, with the green side pods and a blue band over the nose. It had not otherwise been a great week for Tom Walkinshaw, whose chain of garages was in financial trouble. The Scot had sold about half of them to the British Racing Drivers Club, of which he was a member. The only trouble was that the BRDC also owned Silverstone, which Walkinshaw's firm managed. Sensing something of a conflict of interest and suspicious of the murky dealings, BRDC chairman Innes Ireland had Walkinshaw kicked out of the club. There was one new Minardi M192 for Gianni Morbidelli, basically a slight redesign of the M191 by Aldo Costa to fit the bigger engine, and with a slightly raised-nosed and dihedral front wing. And Lotus unveiled their new car too, but the 107 would not be racing here, it was just an unveiling, with smart new overalls in green for the drivers to go with it. Danke Stefan T. 1981 for that little detail, with the team hoping it would be ready to race in Imola and the venerable 102 could finally be put out to pasture. For those keeping track of such things, by the way, Lotus numbered all of their projects from the same list. So the 103 was the abortive new car for 1991, announced along with the signing of Mika Hakkinen, that never got beyond wind tunnel stage. The 104 was an upgrade of the Vauxhall Carlton, or Opel Omega, for racing use. And the 105 and 106 were the racing and road car versions, respectively, of the latest version of the Lotus Esprit, called the X180. No new car for Williams. Why would they need one? But a new higher-revving evolution of the Renault V10, and the team here brought 2 chassis for each of their drivers, one with the old RS3 and one with the new RS4 in the back. While dodging questions about the precise details of the new block, Patrick Head did offer a view on why Patrese had been so off the pace this year compared to Mansell. It's the new active suspension, says Patrick. When the driver brakes, there's just a tiny moment when the computer is sorting out the suspension, and while Mansell just bullies his way through it, Patrese is much more sensitive to the grip and handling and just isn't quite so comfortable. Mansell, for his part, was discussing the traction control system and turned a few heads in the press by claiming that Ferrari had been using such a system back in 1990, which the Scuderia admitted, though it didn't seem to have been doing much of a miraculous job for them. Williams were talking to Ayrton Senna. Frank and Ayrton were seen together at the Imola test as the Brazilian continued to be unhappy with the state of the MP47 despite a month's intensive work on the car. Ron Dennis, desperate for some good news to give Ayrton, flew off to Tokyo to talk to Honda and was somewhat thunderstruck to hear that after winning at least one title every year since 1986, that's 6 years in a row, the firm was considering calling it mission accomplished and pulling out of F1. So it had been something of a fraught April for Ron. At the other end of the pit lane, finally, it was an equally fraught month for Andrea Sassetti. Bernie Eccleston had intervened to get Perry McCarthy his super licence. He appreciated his tenacity, he said. British Mafia, said others, only for Enrico Battaglia to, metaphorically, show up at the wheel of a dump truck full of lira and ask if he could possibly have his job back. Sassetti couldn't say yes quick enough, fired Perry and rehired Enrico, but FISA reminded him that he was only allowed to have 2 driver changes for the season, and he'd made both of them. So Battaglia was back out, McCarthy was back in, and Sassetti was deeply unhappy about the whole thing. You certainly couldn't fault Perry's commitment, though, because when the team refused to pay his travel expenses, he got a job with Checkers Travel as a courier running tours to the races, which allowed him to get there and back on their dime, and he had to room with the mechanics in a dorm. Car 35, Perry McCarthy. Born in the East London borough of Stepney, young Perry first got interested in F1 while at Basildon College and was known as something of a boy racer on the local roads. Working as a spray painter on oil rigs for his father's company to raise funds, by 1983 he was ready to enter Formula Ford 1600, crashing in both the races he entered. His career in the junior formulae progressed slowly as he gained a reputation for speed combined with a habit of crashing and struggled to make an impact on the track or gain sponsors off it. Ken Tyrrell was talking to him about substituting for Jean Alesi in 1989 but settled on Johnny Herbert instead, and McCarthy turned instead to IMSA sports car racing in the US. After yet more bad luck and mechanical problems, he was joint 49th in the standings, but his efforts had brought him to the attention of footwork F1 boss John Wickham, who invited him down for a session, which enabled him to eke out just enough funding to step in when Andrea Moda needed a driver. When the British press, taking his side on the super licence issue, noted that even Gilles Villeneuve would have been denied a licence under the current rules, Perry cheekily adapted the Canadian's legendary helmet colours reversed as his own. Some say he's an unlucky driver with a habit of crashing and no competitive record to speak of. Some say he's an Essex wide boy done good who's persevered and hustled to get to the big time. All we know is he's called Perry McCarthy. With Andrea Moda having reluctantly got cars ready for both their drivers, it was off to pre-qualifying and Perry McCarthy was eager to get out on track. But even that was a bit of a struggle. First of all, because the mechanics had put in an all-nighter building his car, there was nobody in the dorm to wake him. A frantic 90-mile-an-hour dash across town in Andrea Sassetti's hungover brother's rental car, and he was in the garage, but they couldn't start it. A bit enthusiastic with the quick-start fluid, they managed to set Perry on fire. Eventually, though, he got in the car and headed out to fulfil his dream. And 4 metres after he'd crossed the exit line of the pit lane, his engine stopped. And because he'd crossed the line, the mechanics couldn't just drag it back in, start it up and send him out again. His debut was over. Seriously, read his autobiography flat out, flat broke. It's a scream. Anyway, Roberto Moreno's car lasted 3 laps before it too went bang, by which time McCarthy's car had been recovered, fixed, and handed over to Moreno. It didn't make much of a difference in any case, as Roberto was still over 11 seconds off the top of the timesheets, so the Venturis, Alboreto and Chiesa again pre-qualified without too much difficulty, the top 3 covered by just under half a second, with Chiesa struggling a bit more. And then the big boys went out to play on Friday afternoon. And to absolutely nobody's surprise, Mansell topped the times with ease, alternating between the old and new engines as if it was a test session, while being still a second faster than anybody else, while the McLarens were more reliable in Brazil but not a lot faster. And when Saturday's session was washed out by rain, that was that. Michael Schumacher in the new Benetton would take his first front row start in F1, out-qualifying Senna by just 1/100th of a second. Patrese joined Senna on row 2, then Ivan Capelli put his Ferrari 5th, great boost after his troubled start to life at Maranello. With the B192 developed and set up around Schumacher's requirements, Brundle struggled to get his dialed in and could only manage 6th, ahead of Berger and Alesi, whose day was disrupted by his engine catching fire. Wendlinger and Comas rounded out the top 10, with De Cesaris followed by the two De Laras and the other Ligier of Boutsen. Both von Metals qualified despite Chiesa's travails in PQ, and the Swiss driver was ahead of Hakkinen, making what he hoped would be his last start in the 102D from 21st. Fittipaldi in the old Minardi outqualified Morbidelli in the new one, Johnny Herbert dragged his old Lotus onto the grid in last place, and even the March team had something to celebrate when Paul Belmondo qualified for the first time in 23rd. Missing the cut this time were Ukio Katayama, Stefano Modena and both Brabhams, with Damon Hill slowest of all, nearly a second off Van der Poel's time. Sunday morning warm-up took place in a persistent drizzle, but about an hour before the race there was another downpour which thoroughly wet the track, then stopped again. With weather forecasters shrugging and the track damp but drying, teams had decisions to make about setup and tyres. Most went for wet setups, though Mansell, Patrese and Senna hedged their bets with intermediate settings that should work better than full wet settings if the track dried out a bit. The two March drivers and Chiesa in the von Metal went out on slick tyres, gambling that the track would dry quickly and they could move up while everyone else was stopping to change their wets. The Williams twins both opted to start with the older RS3 engine, finding the new one better but still not quite reliable enough, and off they went for the formation lap in front of a pretty paltry crowd of just 38,000. The cars lined up to go under the watchful eye of Roland Brunschreider. On came the lights and away they went, with Alesi fairly exploding off the line as Mansell held the lead, while Schumacher had just dabbed the brakes to stop himself creeping forward when the light went on and was swamped. As they went into turn 1, Mansell led Patrese and Alesi, then the two Benettons of Schumacher and Brundle, then the two McLarens of Berger and Senna. But those drivers starting on slicks were having trouble. Chiesa bounced through a gravel trap, while Wendlinger had dropped from 9th on the grid to 22nd by the end of lap 1. But the talk was all of Alesi's rocket start. Surely he'd jumped the lights and would be penalised. No, it turned out he'd been incredibly fortunate, and the narrow strip of tarmac where his rear wheels had been on the grid was sheltered from the drizzle by the Tio Pepe banner across the track, so while everyone else slithered a bit, he had perfect traction. During lap 1, Senna got past both Berger and Brundle to cross the line 5th, but already the Williamses were starting to pull out, while Brundle had an off-camera half-spin on lap 3, losing 3 spaces and getting going behind Comas's Ligier, as De Cesaris pulled in to retire with a dead engine. Alesi was not only falling behind Patrese, but seemed to be leading something of a train, while Mansell was now leading his teammate by over 3 seconds already. Already it was looking like Spain would be yet another display of Williams' dominance, and Mansell would equal Senna's record from last year of winning the first 4 races of the season. Schumacher was still trying to get past Alesi, now with both McLarens in tow following Brundle's indiscretion. Trying to recover, the Briton went to overtake Comas, but contact was made and he ended up beached on the curbs. 4 retirements from 4 for Martin, and more fuel to the rumours of his imminent replacement by Alessandro Zanardi. Schumacher finally found his way past Alesi, causing Senna to brake and allow Berger through, and as Schumacher set off in a probably futile pursuit of the Williamses, Senna got back past his teammate and followed through past Alesi a lap later on the main straight, and set off likewise in pursuit of the Benetton. Patrese had got his foot down as the Williamses lapped Chiesa, still tiptoeing around on slicks, and the number 6 Williams set fastest lap and pulled in the gap to Mansell to just 2 seconds, the pair now a whopping 12 seconds ahead of Schumacher after just 8 laps. Alesi and Berger were having a fine scrap over 5th, with Berger taking the place and Alesi retaking it, and both still not far behind Senna, with Capelli behind them and also looking for an opening. The slick runners finally gave up and switched to wets as the drizzle continued to fall, and on lap 13 Berger went for the inside at Repsol, Alesi closed the door and the two touched, spinning the Ferrari. Alesi got going in a cloud of tyre smoke but had also lost a place to Capelli. Herbert was another spinner. He'd been doing his usual job of working his way up from the back and was up into midfield before spinning out and stalling on lap 14. No sooner had the Marches and Chiesa changed to wets than the rain stopped, and no longer being kept damp, the track was very quickly starting to dry out. Those who'd started on wet tyres were now finding them going off, but as just about everyone was about to change to slicks, there was more drizzle, and suddenly all bets were off again. Mansell was among traffic now, passing Gugelmin and Hakkinen, but when Patrese arrived to overtake the Finn, he realised he was going a bit quick, braked a bit too hard, and slewed sideways into a wall. No 1-2 for Williams this time out, and Schumacher was restored to his second place from the grid, but with a nearly 22-second gap at about 1/3 distance. Behind Schumacher it was 2x2, with Senna, Berger, Capelli and Alesi making up the remainder of the top 6, with Comas and Guillard 7th and 8th, while Mansell was lapping 9th place Tarquini and presumably not looking forward to encountering the Tyrrell based on previous form. Schumacher was on a gung-ho charge, closing the gap to Mansell to just 10 seconds as the Brit carefully picked his way through the traffic. Once through, he pulled it out again to make it 15, but the conditions continued to be treacherous and the inexperienced Chiesa swapped ends and ended up in a wall, and the much more experienced Gugelmin went off at the last turn. As the McLarens picked their own way gingerly through the traffic, Berger saw an opportunity just before half-distance and overtook, only for Senna to retake the place again shortly afterwards when Berger was balked by Martini's Dallara. They all came past Eric Comas, who'd just had a spin and was recovering. That put Guiar up into 7th in the Tyrrell, until he hit a damp patch and wound up in a gravel trap on lap 32, retirement number 9, after Morbidelli had retired the new Minardi, which was handling atrociously. Somewhat isolated in 6th, Alesi took a chance on coming in for a new set of wet tyres, a good change getting him out well ahead of 7th place Tarquini, flying in the Fonmetal. Alboreto, meanwhile, was also moving up in the footwork, disposing of both Dallaras and gunning for Tarquini. Schumacher continued going flat out, chasing Mansell, who was able to keep the gap at between 14 and 17 seconds, depending on traffic, while the McLarens had also separated out. In fact, the only real movement on the track now was Alesi on fresh tyres charging in pursuit of his teammate, and Alboreto's pursuit of Tarquini. Everyone else was watching Alesi too, as there was still nearly half the race to go, and if he went significantly better there might be a flurry of stops as everyone else followed his example, which could shake things up a bit. Except that by now the track was drying again, with a few actually dry bits appearing on the line, but elsewhere there were still some wet patches and puddles, so most drivers persisted with their worn wet tyres, seeking out wet patches to cool them while waiting to see if the weather would finally make up its mind one way or another. As Alesi charged, he found himself a bit stymied by Häkkinen, who was sticking to the dry line. He nearly did a Patrese, losing it under braking, then perhaps inevitably there was a coming together, which both at least managed to recover from. Among all this, Senna had been catching Schumacher, as 2/3 distance came and went, and was now just 4 seconds behind the Benetton, and both were reducing the gap to Mansell, who was driving well within himself to conserve the car. The heavens opened once more, and Alesi's fresher tyres counted as he made his way up to Capelli, who was in turn lapping Martini in the Dallara, which also had the 1992 spec Ferrari engine now. As the rain continued to fall, Mansell's lead tumbled as Senna and Schumacher charged in pursuit, all three skating around on heavily worn tyres, as 10 seconds now covered the top three, with Alesi having got past Capelli and now charging hard to try and catch Berger. Mansell responded, pulling out a couple of seconds on Schumacher, while Senna had aquaplaned off, come back on, and decided 4 points were better than throwing it off in pursuit of 6 and had backed off. Berger lapped 12th placed Häkkinen, but Alesi had problems with the Lotus again, finally getting through on lap 58 of 65 as Berger's semi-automatic gearbox started playing up. A lap later, Alesi was up with Berger and dove inside at Lecaitcha to take 4th. With 4 laps to make up 15 seconds on Senna, it was a big ask, but he put his foot down and started taking 6 seconds a lap out of the Brazilian's lead. With just 2 laps to go, Senna came up to lap Ivan Capelli's 6th place Ferrari. Would Ivan help his teammate out by making life difficult for Ayrton? The Italian moved over, in fact, but Senna's rear end stepped out and off he went. A couple of laps later, Capelli followed suit, off camera. No such problems for Nigel Mansell as he cruised home to take his 4th win in a row and the 25th of his career, just 2 short now of Jackie Stewart's all-time British record. Michael Schumacher brought the B192 home an excellent second in his 10th race and the car's first, with Jean Alesi rewarded with 3rd after a fine, if dramatic, drive. Gerhard Berger was once again left to pick up the pieces for McLaren with 3 points, and the beneficiaries of Senna's and Capelli's misfortune were Michele Alboreto, taking another 2 points for footwork, and Pierluigi Martini, bringing his Dallara home 6th to take Scuderia Italia's first points since Leto's podium at Imola last year. Suzuki was 7th in the other footwork, a reasonably good day for them, with both Marches and Christian Fittipaldi also still running at the end. Belmondo was last and 4 laps down, but could be commended for just staying on the track when so many others had fallen by the wayside. So maximum points for Mansell still, though Patrese's misfortune means that he's now only a point ahead of the impressive Schumacher in the table, with Alesi pushing Senna down to 6th. After this race, Senna was philosophical about the accident itself, admitting it was a mistake, but saying that the car was so bad he couldn't see any way back into the title race, and shrugged that in that case he might as well retire as come 3rd. The reigning champion still only has 4 points from Kyalami and is currently a whopping 36 behind Mansell. So next to Imola, where the Tifosi will have been buoyed by Alesi's display in the wet, even as they were frustrated by Capelli's accident on the brink of another points finish. Mansell, for his part, will hope that he can extend his extraordinary start to the season to a record-breaking 5 race wins in a row.